I guess we're doing this.
Bear's ears.
Bear's ears.
Bear's ears.
Bear's ears.
Bear's Ears. Today, we're talking about Bear's Ears National Monument. Bear's Ears is quite possibly the most controversial piece of public land in America. It's pretty much front and center for all of the highly contentious, hotly debated public lands issues taking place in the West today. But because of that, it can be kind of hard to figure out what is actually going on at Bear's Ears. Like, what is it? Why are people upset about it? Why do some people want it to be a monument while others don't? That's what I want to answer for you here today. I want to give you the story of Bear's Ears and hopefully give you all the information you need to make an informed decision about one of the most important pieces of public land in America. My name is Cameron, and this is National Park Diaries, where I tell you stories from the world's protected places. This is Bear's Ears Explained. Real quick, I just need 1 minute of your time. I want to thank the sponsor of this video, Babbel. I've worked with Babbel before. They're an online language learning app, and this is an online learning channel. So we fit well together, and I'm happy to work with them. They have over a dozen languages you can learn. I myself have chosen Spanish. I studied abroad in Costa Rica when I was in college, and it made a huge difference with immersing myself in the culture and engaging with the Costa Rican people. But that was a long time ago, and my Spanish is getting rusty. So I'm using Babbel to bring my capabilities back up to par. Their award-winning technology has been proven to get you speaking a new language in just 3 weeks, and their lessons focus on real-world, practical conversations. Plus, they're short, like 10 minutes. And they have podcasts. I really like the Un Día en Español one because they tell you a real-world story with a Spanish speaker and then translate it right afterwards so you can practice your listening skills. So if you want to immerse yourself in a new culture by learning a new language, maybe you're finally taking that long-awaited trip, try Babbel today by clicking the link in my description to get 65% off your subscription. Thank you again to Babbel for sponsoring this video, and let's get back to the story. Okay, so like I said, Bear's Ears is like the punching bag when it comes to a bunch of broader cultural issues on public lands. The issues that arise when talking about Bear's Ears are never just about Bear's Ears. They're about resource extraction and indigenous representation and tourism and public access and all of this other stuff. And one of the tools, the mechanisms that allows this land to be set aside and inflame these broader cultural debates is the Antiquities Act. Now, I was originally going to do a separate video on the Antiquities Act, but it doesn't make a lot of sense to talk about Bear's Ears without talking about the Antiquities Act. Bear's Ears was one of the main areas the Antiquities Act was created to protect. It's one of those things where having the context of what's at stake is much more helpful to the overall conversation. So I'm going to do a quick mini explainer on the Antiquities Act before we dive into Bear's Ears proper.
Bear's ears.
Okay, Antiquities Act. Signed in 1906 by President Theodore Roosevelt. It came about because a bunch of indigenous archaeological sites in the American Southwest, like Bear's Ears, were being looted, stolen from, and pilfered. And proponents of the act wanted a mechanism for these sites to be protected, and protected quickly. Like, national parks were a thing at this time, but they were still pretty new, and it took a long time for Congress to create them. Proponents wanted someone to be able to step in quickly and say, hey, this place is under threat. It is now protected. And according to the Antiquities Act, that someone is the President of the United States. They have unilateral control over creating new national monuments under the Antiquities Act. And I think it would be helpful to just read the relevant section here. You can read the whole act in like 15 minutes probably, but there's really one paragraph that's super relevant. It says, quote, "The President of the United States is authorized, in his discretion, to declare by public proclamation historic landmarks, historic and prehistoric structures, and other objects of historic or scientific interest that are situated upon the lands owned or controlled by the government of the United States to be national monuments, and may reserve as part thereof parcels of land, the limits of which in all cases shall be confined to the smallest area compatible with proper care and management of the objects to be protected." Okay, so again, this is just giving the president the power to quickly protect places of historic or scientific interest. and most presidents have used this power, like more than 200 times. All of them except 3 since the act was passed. Nixon, Reagan, and H.W. Bush did not. And in general, the Antiquities Act has been pretty popular with the general public. Like, half of our current national parks were first protected under the Antiquities Act, including the Grand Canyon, Zion, Olympic, Grand Teton. The Statue of Liberty was protected this way, and Devil's Tower in Wyoming was the first ever place to be protected by the Antiquities Act. So there are a lot of beloved places in America that the Antiquities Act has played a role in protecting, and to this day remain very popular. But it hasn't been without its controversies. Almost right off the bat, in 1908, Teddy Roosevelt used the Antiquities Act to set aside 800,000 acres in the Grand Canyon, and this miner by the name of Ralph Cameron, who had mining claims in the canyon, challenges it and essentially says, "You can't do that. That's too much land. The monument is too big." This goes all the way to the Supreme Court, who rules in favor of the Antiquities Act. They rule that the canyon itself is a, quote, object of unusual scientific interest, end quote, and that the president was justified in his use of the act to protect it. Actually, I gotta do a video on that. Ralph Cameron is a super interesting dude, plus he gives Camerons a bad rap, and I feel compelled to unsully our good name. Let me know in the comments if you'd like to see that. But anyway, this Supreme Court case was super important. It set the precedent that the president could set aside large monuments in the name of preservation, and gave judicial backing to the fact that landscapes themselves were significant. Now, the law has come under attack several more times since then. Grand Teton in 1950, Death Valley in 76, Alaska in 78, Grand Staircase Escalante in 97, and Northeast Canyons and Seamounts in 2021. But each time, the courts have upheld the president's authority to use the Antiquities Act. And this, finally, is where we return to Bears Ears. Because Bears Ears was kinda sorta like on the list of OG places to be protected by the Antiquities Act. See, there's this guy, Edgar Lee Hewitt. He really liked archaeology, like a lot. He basically wrote the Antiquities Act, and he had this list of 20 different places in the Southwest that he thought were worthy of protection. By my count, like 16 are now under federal protection of some sort, so he kind of knew his stuff. One of those places he called the Bluff District, which is basically where Bears Ears is today. He lists the Bluff District, Bears Ears, as one of the top 4 most important places to be protected under the Antiquities Act. He said it deserved, quote-unquote, immediate action. It preserves like 13,000 years of human history, and there's something like 100,000 cultural sites in the area. It's a deeply sacred place for 5 separate indigenous tribes, including the Zuni, Hopi, Ute, Ute Mountain Ute, and Navajo. They still visit this area to perform ceremonies and visit sacred sites. And it's extremely ecologically and geologically diverse. But 100 years is not immediate. Yeah, he published that report in 1906, but Bears Ears was not formally protected until 2016. In that time, the area continued to be looted, vandalized, and destroyed. And that brings us to the sort of modern day Bears Ears. The Bears Ears that's so controversial. Let's talk about the timeline of events real quick, and then we'll dive into the issues. So, like I mentioned, Bears Ears was formally protected for the first time in 2016. President Obama set aside 1.3 million acres after years of collaboration and input from stakeholders, including the indigenous tribes of the area. In fact, this was the first time a national monument was created at the request of indigenous tribes themselves. And actually, they would have a say in how this one was run. Obama's monument declaration created the Bears Ears Commission, which is made up of members of the 5 tribes and gives them a say in managing the monument, right alongside the BLM and the Forest Service. His proclamation also withdrew the land from new oil and gas leasing and mining claims, as well as put restrictions on off-road vehicle use. But as we know, the Antiquities Act is not without its controversies, and opponents quickly decried the monument as an example of federal overreach. In 2017, President Trump reduced the size of the monument by 85% and split it into 2 separate units. His administration claimed that 1.3 million acres was unnecessary and that other federal laws would provide adequate protection. He also reinstated oil and gas leasing and mining claims. These lawsuits were still ongoing when President Biden took office, and in 2021, he ultimately restored Bears Ears to its original boundaries, where they still stand today. There were more lawsuits claiming Biden didn't have this authority either, so this is what Bears Ears has been reduced to: a political football caught in the middle of the broader fight over public lands in the West. But what are the issues? What are people fighting about? This is the whole reason I wanted to make this video, to give you a better understanding of what those issues are and hopefully allow you to come to your own conclusion about Bears Ears. So let's start with the monument's proponents, people who are in favor of a relatively large Bears Ears National Monument. Proponents cite the extensive collection of indigenous artifacts and sites spread across the landscape. I mentioned earlier that there's something like 13,000 years of human history here and more than 100,000 cultural sites. But proponents also say that the landscape itself is significant, that even if there's not a site or artifact spread over every square inch of this monument, the land itself represents the lifestyle and culture of the people who used to, and still do, call it home. That it's a living landscape which as a whole tells their story. Proponents say that without the protection of a national monument, this landscape would continue to be threatened by looting and vandalism, as well as resource extraction. Then, of course, there's the co-management of Bears Ears by indigenous tribes and the federal government. This arrangement is a huge leap forward for reconnecting the tribes of this region with a landscape that is incredibly important and meaningful to them, and which has historically been denied to them. Another argument says that the monument will increase tourism and bring more economic opportunities to a region in desperate need of them. And finally, those in favor of a national monument cite public support for both the monument and the Antiquities Act, as well as the long history of unsuccessful legal challenges against the act as justification for the monument's creation. Now, opponents of Bears Ears, those who don't think it should be a national monument, at least not as it currently is, cite a variety of other reasons in opposition. They claim that increased recreation and tourism are actually hurting the monument, and that the cultural sites will be better protected without it. They say that with the increase in visitation, sensitive sites are overwhelmed by trash and human waste, hurting the very thing the monument was intended to protect. They also take aim at the smallest area possible clause of the Antiquities Act, stating the boundaries of Bears Ears are not actually the smallest area needed to protect these sites. They see the designation of a large monument like this as a case of government overreach, which deprives the region of economic opportunities through oil and gas development, as well as mining jobs. Then there's the question of public school funding. See, there's this funky arrangement in Utah where certain parcels of land are designated as state trust lands, where the revenue generated from those lands, most of which comes from oil and gas leasing, is earmarked for public education. Opponents are worried that federal control of the monument puts that revenue stream at risk. But here's the thing, if you think of all these arguments like ingredients in a soup and you put them in a pot and boil them down to their simplest form, like get at the heart of the Bears Ears controversy, I think what you'll find is an argument over culture. There are different ways of life here, but they both have cultural connections to the land. On the one hand, you have a group trying to re-establish an indigenous connection to the land, and who puts a lot of weight on conservation and resource preservation. On the other hand, you have a group used to a more traditional Western lifestyle, who praise a more self-sufficient way of living and who oppose more regulation and increased federal control. I'm not here to pass judgment on either of these, but let me at least give you my feelings on this issue. I support Bears Ears, and I support the Antiquities Act. I find the argument in favor of landscape scale preservation very compelling, and I think Bears Ears is a very worthy candidate for protection. It's one of the most culturally and historically dense landscapes in the country, and for over 100 years it's been threatened by looting and vandalism. It's the exact type of place the Antiquities Act was designed to protect. Edgar Lee Hewitt certainly thought so. A lot of monuments previously protected by the Act enjoy widespread public support and have survived over a century of judicial challenges, so clearly there's a precedent for this type of action. Although that might be changing, I'll leave a link in the description if you want to learn more about that. I also think a lot of the concerns about the impact of increased visitation can be adequately handled with more funding and education, and aren't necessarily an indictment of the monument itself. In fact, there's an organization called Friends of Cedar Mesa doing some really good work in this area about responsible visitation. They have an excellent initiative called Visit with Respect. Check it out if you're thinking about visiting Bears Ears, links in the description. But in the end, that's just my preference. My position just happens to align with how I think about the world, and conservation and protected places. And I hope I've given you enough information to begin to understand how you think about those things. There's links to a bunch of resources in the description, and I'd love to hear your thoughts on Bears Ears in the comments below. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more park stories. It really does help out the channel. Follow me on Instagram, check out my Patreon, and I'll see you all next time. Thank you for watching. Goodbye.
Bear's ears.